Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one's about Job.
Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Thanks for hanging out with me here and talking about the book of Job, which is one that when you read it as a kid, maybe your first time through the Bible, you're like, this is boring and different from everything I've read in the Bible so far. It gets a little heady for me. And I think the reason that this book doesn't appeal to the young reader as much is because usually, at least in our cultural context, the young reader hasn't suffered very much yet. But this is a book that takes on more and more meaning as life goes on for people and as they come back around to it and realize, oh, dang, Job is wrestling with some of the questions that I wrestle with as I get further along in life. And indeed, that's what I've discovered as I've picked Job back up for the first time in a long time in anticipation of the conversation that you and I are having right now. But nuts and bolts wise, Job, right off the bat, it's going to read way different than everything we've seen so far. The only thing that's even kind of familiar that we've read so far compared to Job is the stuff like right at the very, very beginning with the creation account and a conversation happening in the presence of God. Because like Genesis, Job opens not necessarily in time or space as we think of it, but somewhere else entirely. And that's kind of a helpful cue with the way the books of the Bible are ordered in terms of understanding that, all right, not only is this set somewhere different, but Job just feels different from a literary sense. If you had no clue and you didn't know anything about the Bible or how it's structured or anything, you just started reading through it and you're like, all right, there's 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, all of it feels like story. Well, after that, things feel different. There's a break. Now we're into a whole new genre of literature, and we're bouncing around to different places in time. Job doesn't read like a story. So this then is the first book in a new section of the Bible, a subsection of the Old Testament that smart fancy people refer to as wisdom literature. It's not pure narrative. It's not pure history. This is people interacting with the reality of God through poetry and prose and song and philosophy and proverbs and reflection. And what we get in Job is a pretty unique genre. It's just a little bit of story mixed with tons of hypothetical dialogue and reflection. Now, we see this type of genre in Greek philosophy, where you'll have a thinker or a hypothetical thinker interacting with an idea and having an imagined debate back and forth. This is how Plato famously captured the essence of his teacher, Socrates, and wrote about him after the fact. This is how Justin Martyr, the early Christian author, probably wrote his famous dialogue with Trypho. It's okay if you don't know what those things are. I just bring them up as other historical examples of this somewhat unusual genre that, again, is going to be very jarring when you're just cruising through the Bible and you get to Job. So let's talk about what actually goes down here. It opens with a bunch of celestial beings. I don't know what to call them. They're participants in a conversation that's happening in the throne room of God, like God is holding court or something. I don't think what we're reading here is supposed to be understood as a literal description of how things work in the heavenly realms. And for that matter, I'm not even sure that we're getting any kind of literal description of a literal thing that actually happened to a guy in the book of Job. And I think the original audience, whenever that was, would have been very clear one way or the other on whatever's going on here. But this scenario that's put before us, whatever you make of it, has God being like, who's pretty great is Job. He's a very faithful servant. And Satan's like, yeah, but that's only because you're always nice to him. And Satan's like, raise your hand against him, make him suffer, and you'll see what he's actually made of. And so God, interestingly, isn't like, okay, I will punish him. Instead, God removes his hand, his edict of protection that for whatever reason up till this point he's bestowed upon Job and his household. And he allows pain and suffering and evil that was wanting to happen anyway to go unchecked for a minute against Job. And the results are terrifying and horrible. God sets a boundary condition here that Satan, or the accuser, as he's literally called here, can't actually lift his hand against Job. And remember, there's sort of a contest, a question here that is initiating all of this. So Job has to live through it to find out what really he makes of God's justice and whether God rules the world the right way. And so it's a very odd setup as Job has basically everything taken from him, and all of this suffering compounds with his wife just saying, he's got to give up on God, curse God, and just die. It's over. But Job won't curse God. He will, however, heavily question God. And the majority of the book is carried out in this dialogue I've been alluding to, where three of his buddies show up, a guy named Eliphaz the Temanite, Zophar the Naamathite, and Bildad the Shuhite. Now, this is a good place to pause and acknowledge that nobody knows when this story is happening. We've got some location names that maybe fit kind of with where this is supposed to occur. Some people think that this is set during the age of the kings or maybe even during the exile, because Job a couple of times references known proverbs and psalms. But other people think this is maybe the oldest book in the Bible, and that it's referencing something way back from the time of Abraham or even earlier. So we don't know where this is happening. We don't know when this is happening. That clearly isn't the point of the book. And if anything, the lack of clarity on those questions just accentuates how universal these questions are. The experience of suffering and wrestling with the idea that we're here, we're made, clearly something made this, clearly it's still attended to, or it would spiral to chaos. And so there's some kind of order or justice to all of this, but it seems like what just happened to me or this other person is not just. So how does that work? That's a very universal question, and the author of this book, I think, does a very clever thing in disguising some of those specifics so that we won't fixate on that as an audience. What we can say about the author of this book is that this is a very well-rounded thinker who's apparently quite conversant in literature and science and philosophy and theology, and all of that is brought to bear, especially moving forward from chapter 3 as we get into this big dialogue section that occurs. Well, these friends who show up are maybe doing their best, but they're all operating from an assumption that skews their ability to offer proper comfort and help Job out. Their assumption is all the ground rules of everything are kind of like the Mosaic covenant. If you're good, God blesses you. If you're bad, God punishes you. Job is good. Even God affirms this at the very beginning. So why on earth would he be getting punished? Well, the only conclusion that these three friends can come to is somehow you must have got something wrong. But Job isn't down with that, and he goes through this whole cycle of conversation. They say something, he refutes it, because Job is on a journey. He's wrestling with an idea, and what Job of a chapter in the teens is wrestling through is going to be really different than what Job in a given chapter in the 20s is going to be wrestling through. You have to read this one as a whole to track carefully the flow of thought and the real deep water grappling with this question that is among the most important and complex that people try to deal with. Job doesn't arrive at the same conclusion as his friends. He's like, no, I'm blameless. I'm telling you, I'm blameless. Quit trying to pin something on me to make your worldview work. And all Job can come up with, knowing in his heart that he is blameless, is that maybe God just isn't as good as he thought God was. In a way, the friends all represent what would have been a popular answer to the question of suffering back in the day, and really all three of them you can kind of attach to popular answers to the question of suffering today as well. And all three of the friends' solutions, as well as really Job's solution to the problem of suffering, turn out to be a dead end. Well then, as we get toward the end of this dialogue sequence, another friend shows up, and his name is Elihu the Buzite. And he's apparently younger than the other guys, and so he's like, well, I waited to speak because they're older than me. And Elihu gives a more thoughtful take on why suffering occurs. It's a little bit more noble, if you will. He's like, well, maybe, God's trying to teach you something. And I think even in this day and age, of all of the different takes that are offered in this section of Job regarding suffering, that's the one that's probably the most popular. But if you really think about that, and you will if you haven't yet, as life goes on and you suffer more and you watch other people suffer more, there's some problems with that as a catch-all solution to the problem of evil as well. And so we come out of this dialogue phase saying, okay, the three friends initially, they didn't really knock it out of the park. And Elihu, he gave a better, more mature answer. And Job, I mean, he's the one who's actually suffered. He's just an emotional mess. but still trying to do right, but we don't have the problem of evil solved. And so then around chapter 30, Job appeals to God. He's like, my friends can't answer the question. I've tried to wrestle it through. I can't answer the question. I want answers on this. I'm innocent and I've been mistreated. What the heck, God? And then crazily, God shows up and answers his question. Well, like that's the $1 billion thing, right? That's what we all want when it comes to the problem of pain and suffering. It's just God to come and make it clear. Tell me why. Effectively, God's answer is, you're not equipped to understand that. It doesn't seem like God is totally offended by the question, but he quickly disabuses Job of the notion that he's entitled to an answer on that. And he does so by talking about his great power and the scope of things, down from little details in nature to the grand scheme of how the cosmos turns and functions. And then he goes into this segment where he talks about these two remarkable creatures. Maybe there's some creature that still exists that we're aware of. Maybe they're some kind of now extinct megafauna. But these creatures God references, the Leviathan and the Behemoth, what they have in common is they demonstrate the wild power and apparent chaos and danger of the physical world of existence. And God's ultimate point is, Job, you simply aren't capable of running the equation of my justice or lack thereof. He even offers Job sort of this Damoclean bargain. Again, a few episodes back, we talked about the sword of Damocles and that Greek myth or legend. And he's like, okay, Job, well, what would it be like if you ran the show? Would you be able to zip around all day and just punish everybody who did something bad? And God's point is, it's not that simple. There's a ripple effect to all of it. And neither you nor any human nor all the humans combined, paraphrases very much mine, are capable of even starting to scratch the surface of running such moral, ethical justice calculations. You can't do it, and I'm limited by nothing, so I guess I could just sit here forever and explain it to you, but there's no chance of you understanding it because you simply aren't in a position to do so as a finite mortal. And ultimately, the conclusion seems to be, reasonable question, Job, but when you really stop and think about it, your only option here is to trust in my justice. That isn't as neat and tidy as the proposals that the three friends threw out, which is, you must have just done something naughty that maybe you forgot about or something. It's not even as neat and tidy as the more noble-sounding solution that Elihu offers, which is, well, he's trying to teach you a lesson. And God's answer at the end maybe isn't even as satisfying from a human perspective as Job's noble quest of wrestling it through, but it is God's answer. And Job sees that he's right, he bends the knee, and withdraws his complaint. And then in the final scene, God restores to Job that which was taken from him. I think it's right and appropriate that Job is positioned in our Bibles as the first of the wisdom books, because thematically the big point is you're not going to get everything, but trusting in the wisdom of God, the judgment of God, the rightness of God is the wisest thing you can do. It's the best bet you've got for getting things right and navigating the complexities of life and death and justice and suffering in this world in general. When you picture Job, picture a guy completely disheveled, covered in ashes and in mourning, and friends gathering around him to have a long dialogue about how he found himself in that state. When you think about the theme of Job, think about trusting in God's judgment and God's wisdom. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, read chapters 38 through the end of the book so you can hear God's answer to the question of suffering in its entirety. And with that, there's another level up for both of us. We got Job. Next time around, on to the Psalms. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.